Hello,
And
everyone.
yep, it is all yours.
It's actually just perfect. Intin talked about in-game and uh, interface, and now I'm here to talk about UI design basics. So it's just the all the interface. so, like I was saying, UI design just encompasses everything which that stands for user interface. Sometimes we see with a G, it's for graphic user interface, but it means exactly the same thing. And it just encompasses the text box, the buttons, every graphics you will encounter to create an experience, a game experience. So even in very retro game, like there was UI design by like the heart to display the health bar, this kind of things, it's UI design. But let's just introduce myself a bit. So I'm Ayael. I work on a visual novel called Imperial Grace that will have a Kickstarter in a few months. So self-promo. And I am the director, the UI designer, the programmer, and the writer of this game. And I learned UI design the hard way, but I really grow into it. And today I'm going to try to share some basics so you can start to create it yourself. So we are going to talk first about the colors, then the fonts, then the shape, then the polish, and then we are going to talk about a few general tips. So first, the color, how to pick the right colors for your project. Disclaimer, everything as I am going to say is just general rules of thumb you can use to start, and by no means just stick with it if you have another idea. Like if you want to do exactly the contrary of everything I'm going to say, it's okay. Do you think there is a lot of reason to do things differently, and I'm really talking about the basics rules, the basic rules. So first, something to know that colors always have symbol or feelings. So for example, I took the blue, and blue usually convey some kind of tranquility, some kind of wisdom, of stability, of freedom. It can also be associated with the sky and the ocean. And from the previous talk, it's true, it's also associated with medicine. Maybe it might be more the green too. But yeah, there is something, this you have to think when you create your design is like what the color I'm choosing will convey. And you can choose to go with the symbol. So if you have the C10, you decide to do some blue color, even if it's quite dark. And on the contrary, if you have something very wholesome and just like soothing, you can take blue because of the tranquility aspect. I included a link where all the colors are displayed. I don't have the time to go over all the colors in my talk right now, but you can check by yourself if you're interested in this subject. Now, when you create UI, you will need two colors. It doesn't mean like you have to have two hexadecimal colors and that's all. It means you have to pick two broad colors like blue and green. There is a lot of shades of blue you can use and a lot of shades of green you can use. But I usually recommend to not use more than two main colors, because after it can really feel crowded. The only exception are black and white that are always good to use no matter the main colors you choose. But yeah, actually, currently, the aesthetic is really on the sober and really not crowded kind of design. So here you are. If you want to, if you have a medieval fantasy, a science fiction, an horror themed or heavy themes, magic, this kind of stuff, usually it works with a dark base. So like a dark shade of blue, for example, and the light accentuation. And it's the contrary for the slice of life, school life, comedy, melancholic stories, cute settings and stuff. I put a little asterisk on science fiction because science fiction is really interesting because it's usually very, very contrasting. Like you will get very dark color and very vivid accentuation color. And for comedy, it's the same. You usually get some light colors and some very vivid accentuation. While for cute story, you are more going to lean into the pastels colors. So here are some tips to start. Think about what you want to convey as feelings and do like this. So for example, as an illustration, I took the fractured UI, which is purple toned, and we can see a very good use of the same color, purple, but in different shades, and it works very well. Like the very bright and the very dark shade of the same color is really complementary. And it's a magic thing. So for my game UI, I went into a very deep red and some very bright golden accentuation. On the other hand, for a jam game I made, I used some very pastels, soothing color because it's a melancholic stories. So I went for a very bright beige main UI and a brown type of accentuation. Please Be Happy UI that I really like is also into this kind of white based color, very pastel names. We can see the little question mark in very pastel green, and white text with a brown overlay to give a very nice cozy cottage feeling, who works very well for the game. But then there is people who goes on a totally different direction and just try to get a very coherent feeling. So I took two UI I really like, The Good People and Made of Chapel Bleu, which are medieval story themed, and they go full into the old manuscript book aesthetic, and it works very well. Even if it's fantasy settings, and the other one is a mystery. It's a Made of Chapel Bleu is a medieval mystery game. So they went to bright colors and it works very well because, as I was saying, do your thing. And on this case, I really like how the UI is perfectly part of the global aesthetic and completely melt with the sprite and the background. Now, the fonts. There is different type of fonts, and knowing the name will be actually helpful because you can search for this particular type of font in Google Font, DeFont, or any website a bit serious where you can find fonts. So having the name is actually pretty useful. So first, there is serif. Serif are actually a font where there is little decoration around each letters. The one I'm circling in red, that's serif. Sans serif, on the contrary, doesn't have this little decoration. When we look at it, we see it's pretty obvious, like for the F, for example, there is nothing. So it's a much easier font, simpler font. Serif is elegant. It's classic. It's also used a lot in historical settings. For example, as the fonts of Stencil tools are serif fonts. It's just because when they were printed, the first printed were in serif fonts to try to mimic the beautiful fonts of the manuscript and such. So that's why it's always associated with historical settings. But it's also give a sense of nobility, richness, elegance, this kind of things. Sans serif fonts, on the contrary, are simplicity and modernity. They are the easiest fonts to read, so usually it's a very good idea to have an option for a sans serif font in your work if you want to make a more accessible font for people who have trouble reading long portion of text. Because of this, they are very used in slice of life, comedy, or modern setting in general. Handwriting give a sense of delicacy and fragility. They can be used in a lot of works, but I do not recommend to use them except maybe on names or titles like very, very, very big fonts because it's very hard to read. And finally, monospace give a tech feeling because it actually comes from the computers. Like the first computer couldn't display a different space between each font, so each letters add the same space. So that's why they are usually larger than the others, and I don't think they are used in any other case than one who feel tech or sci-fi, this kind of thing. There is subcategory for each font. Once again, in the 20-minute talk, I don't have the time to go over all of this, but I give you a link to go more in detail about this. It's truly interesting to see how fonts can convey a really different feeling themselves. Then we are going to talk about shape. How do we pick the right shape? So one question you probably ask yourself if you are doing your own UI is, do I use text or icons for the buttons? And both have good points or bad points. So texts are very readable, but they are crowded. Usually it takes a lot of space and you have to be careful if you want to translate your game to translate this, and they can take more or less space in another language. On the other hand, icons are usually shorter, but they are also usually not always significant. To convey basic things like the kind of things we find in the settings, like full screen, windowed, font size, mute, unmute, this kind of thing is usually easy to find a significant symbol. But other time, if you want to display something more complicated, it can be hard to find something that will have the same meaning for everyone. Once again, different type of buttons convey different types of feels. Text have some kind of elegance and classiness, while rounded icons give a sense of cuteness and positivity. It's nice to look. And sharper kind of icons are more in the modernity and sci-fi, military kind of vibe, for example. And it's the same for more global shape. Like traditionally, sharp shape, like a rectangle or triangle or even hexagon and stuff like that, will give a sense of elegance and stability and modernity, but in the industrial sense. Sci-fi, military, it's also used a lot in fantasy. While rounded shape, who are nicer to the eyes, give a more positive feelings. So it will be more used in slice of life, melancholic stories, cute for giving a cute vibe, this kind of things. To example again, there is a Space Lord UI, which is clearly sci-fi themed, and we can see all the sharpness in the text box, the very rectangular choices box, this kind of things, even the hexagon for the buttons. And on the other hand, Trouble Come Twice UI, which is a slice of life comedy kind of game, have rounded squared icon, a rounded type of font too, rounded icons, etc., etc. And now the maybe most important things of this talk, because I feel like this little polish trick make all the differences. Like usually it's with that I decide if someone know what he's doing or not. First, transparency. Transparency, especially when you have beautiful art assets in game, is a very useful tool because you can just show off all your beautifulness everywhere, even in your UI. So it's perfect. It's also something very elegant, but transparency works only with simple things like if you have a very complex ornament, don't make it transparent or it might lose some interest. Then there is the use of patterns. They are once again very good to give a very elegant vibe or to take a lot of space and then in an empty screen, like this one is a chapter screen. So it's usually a lot of space for a little text and you have to close everything. But patterns can be very heavy too. So use it with moderation once again. For example, I'm not particularly fond of pattern used in text boxes, because if you don't make a transparent kind of very discrete patterns, it can take the attention. You know, it can make the font more harder to read because of this, because the patterns will take all the attention to the eyes. So use them carefully, but they can be big allies. Then there is texture. My tip is to use abstract watercolors, image, everything, everywhere, all the time. Texture really gives you a different vibe. Like the same UI without texture just look more plain. Even if a lot of people won't even notice there is a texture of this beige watercolors image in background, it's here and it adds life and it makes things a bit more, I don't know, a bit more lively actually. So if you have a lot of simple background, if you don't want to use pattern, use textures to make it less plain. And finally, there is ornaments. Ornaments are very useful because they will just add a layer of classiness or elegancy to your work, but they can also convey a lot of things in your UI. For example, if you have a sea-themed game, you want to use shells, for example, or fish or stuff like that. Ornaments can really, really help to make an UI more beautiful and in the same time more intent with what you wanted to create. A few general tips now. First, get references. Artists, when they paint, draw, or anything, they look at work they like and they ask themselves, how did they do that? Okay, what do I like in this picture? If you want to do your own UI, do the same. Like when you see a pretty UI, you just screenshot it or at least take 5 minutes to look at it and see, okay, why I like it so much. Okay, now I see why. Of course, inspiration is not plagiarism. Don't make the same UI as someone else, but it's always good to get references and to take inspiration. Then user comfort over aesthetic. especially when we start, it's easy to get really carried away and to have a lot of texture, a lot of patterns, a lot of ornaments, and it makes the text unreadable. And but they're like, it's so pretty to look at, but it's not the most important. UI serves a game, so your text must be really easy to read. Think about all the readability and accessibility options you can, and always prioritize them over a beautiful UI. A simple UI, but which is really easy to read, is always better than a beautiful one with unreadable. And finally, I just give you a lot of resources I use myself to find patterns, ornaments, textures, icons. Always be careful of the licenses. Some are good for commercial projects, others are only good for free games. Some needs to be credits, other not. Look at it, use them, they are here for that. And for the couple of minutes we have left, I just would like to show you a couple of examples of UI I like and explain you why I think they are very good. So we can see a bit in action everything I just said. So this is the Colors of Fate UI. The graphics behind it is incredible. And I think they made a very good choices in using transparency and having the UI being on the left and letting a lot of space for the background picture to shine. When you have beautiful in-game art like this, it doesn't need to have a over-the-top UI. Show what you have. So we have a use of transparency a lot, and it's also really rounded for the because the game is, how do I say that? The game is in some kind of medieval world, and it's serious, but it's also very fairy tale kind of mood. So I think it works well with that. Then there is the UI of Mitsushi, which is extremely simple, and I love it because they really nailed the color choice. So it's always on point with the backgrounds, and it's not as simple than it looks in the first eye. Like if you look at the text box, you will see the name box will have the outline not aligned with the background. So it's just a little detail who had lives. We will see that the transparency of the border is not the same than the transparency of the text box itself. So it looks a bit more ornate, this kind of things. So simple is not always bad at all. It can be very elegant. And finally, there is the Cinderella phenomenon, Evermore UI, which is just very, very original. And I like it for that. Like it's just a bit too crowded for my own personal taste. But the thing I was talking about user accessibility is right on point. Like even if it's go completely differently than the standard save load screen, it's perfectly understandable. They made everything clear, and so they nailed it on this regards. And that's all. If you have questions, I will answer them with pleasure.
All right, who has questions? Let's see. We're letting chat catch up. There was a lot of people just gawking at like all the pretty UI you were showing the whole talk.
Yeah.
Everyone was just like, oh my God, that's amazing. That's amazing. This other thing's amazing. Okay. All right. Someone asked you, what role do I as a programmer have in making sure games are accessible? It's hard when I'm not the one designing the UI usually, and I have trouble speaking my mind sometimes in group settings. So do you have any opinions about that?
Screenshots. I mean, for example, if you want to convey an ID, you can use other example to show, okay, they did that for their accessibility and it worked very well. I want the same thing. you can say that to your UI designer. Overall, for accessibility, think about the size of the font, the type of the font. You can give the option to the player to change it. So for example, for my game, Imperial Grace, there is a sans serif font, which is the default one and which is very pretty, but I know some people have trouble to read it. So I offer the option for a sans serif one and the dyslexic one too. But yeah, usually think also about what makes sense. Like, show your game to someone who never played a RenP game ever, and if they know where to click to do what they want, you have nailed it. If they struggle to think, okay, what is a button, what is not a button, you have a problem. Use contrasted color, like never use the same color for a button than for the main text, so people knows, okay, this is a different color, so this is a button and not a random text displayed on the screen. I hope it answers the question.
Cool. All right, last question. There's a couple of people asking for resources and stuff, so you can link those in chat. But the last question is, how do I know when my transparency is too much or not enough?
Can you read the text over your transparency or not? That's as simple as that. Like, if you have transparency, things about outlined. They are very good at counterbalancing the transparency. For example, in the Please Be Happy UI that I show, the text is on a very, very subtle transparent thing, and they have outlined to make sure the text is readable. Shading, having also transparency who is not the same. For example, where the text box is, it can be, say, 50%, and on top of it, it can be like 25%. So you can make, I don't have the word in English, some kind of shade so the transparency is readable where you have the text. It's the most important thing.
Yeah, I think in Photoshop we used to like drop shadows and stuff around it to
Yeah.
Yep. All right, thank you so much for your talk. Everyone really loved it. And Maxi, you're up.
To everyone's disgrace. Anyway, let's see, do that thing where I share the screen. Wait, yeah,